Luke Jennings had forgotten what it meant to be needed. The auction yard buzzed with mockery as he signed papers for the horse they called Untouchable, a massive black stallion whose eyes held the same hollow stare Luke saw in his mirror each morning. Titan stood 17 hands high, scarred and trembling with rage that no gentle hand had ever soothed. The townspeople whispered about the foolish veteran throwing away his disability check on a beast destined for the slaughterhouse. But Luke saw something else in those wild eyes, a reflection of his own abandoned soul, waiting for someone to believe that broken didn't mean worthless. As he led Titan toward the trailer, the horse's hooves struck the ground like thunder, and Luke felt his heart beat for the first time in years. Subscribe now to witness how two forgotten souls find their way back to grace. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on Luke Jennings' weathered face as he stood at the edge of the livestock auction yard, watching the crowd part like the Red Sea around the massive black stallion in pen 17. Titan. That's what the auctioneer called him, though the name felt more like a curse than a blessing in this place where broken animals came to die. The horse stood nearly 18 hands high, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian, despite the neglect that showed in his protruding ribs, and the wild, untrusting fire that burned in his dark eyes. Luke's calloused fingers gripped the metal railing until his knuckles turned white, feeling something stir in his chest that had been dormant since the roadside bomb in Kandahar took his hearing in his left ear and his faith in tomorrow. The other bidders gave Titan a wide berth, their conversations peppered with words like dangerous, unpredictable, and waste of good money. But Luke heard something different in the stallion's labored breathing. The same desperate rhythm that had kept him awake for 7 years since coming home. When Titan's massive head turned toward him, their eyes met across the dusty arena, and Luke felt the weight of recognition settle between them like a prayer neither knew how to speak. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the afternoon heat like a whip, calling for opening bids on this fine specimen of horseflesh, though his tone suggested anything but confidence in the animal's worth. Luke watched as the crowd shifted uncomfortably, boots shuffling in the dirt, as men who'd spent their lives around livestock suddenly found their boots fascinating. Titan's nostrils flared with each breath, his massive frame trembling not with fear, but with the kind of rage that comes from being handled roughly by too many hands that saw him as nothing more than meat on hooves. The stallion's previous owner had been a wealthy businessman from Dallas who'd bought him as a show horse, only to discover that Titan's spirit couldn't be broken by traditional methods, or any methods for that matter. 3 trainers had tried and failed, each leaving with stories of a horse that seemed to harbor a personal vendetta against humanity itself. Luke knew that feeling intimately, the way the world could turn its back on you when you stopped being useful, when your wounds became inconvenient reminders of things people preferred to forget. The bidding started at $500, a pittance for a horse of Titan's bloodline, but even that seemed too much for an animal that most considered a liability waiting to happen. "Do I hear 500? The auctioneer called out, his voice echoing off the metal bleachers, where families sat eating funnel cake and pretending this wasn't a place where dreams came to be sold by the pound. Luke felt his hand rise almost involuntarily, his fingers forming the gesture that would change both their lives forever. The crowd turned to stare at him, this graying man in worn jeans and a faded army t-shirt, and he could see the mixture of pity and amusement in their faces. They knew him as the quiet veteran who lived alone on the old Henderson place, the one who kept to himself and paid his bills on time, but never quite seemed to belong anywhere. Titan's ears pricked forward at the sound of Luke's bid, and for a moment the stallion's wild thrashing stilled, as if he too was trying to understand what was happening. The auctioneer looked around hopefully for another bidder, but the silence stretched like a held breath until he finally brought his gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to seal their fate. "Sold to the gentleman in the army shirt for $500, he announced, and Luke felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot that had lived there since the day he'd come home to an empty house and a purple heart that couldn't fill the silence. The paperwork took longer than the actual bidding, forms and liability waivers that painted Titan as everything short of a four-legged apocalypse. Luke signed each document with the same steady hand that had once diffused improvised explosive devices in the mountains of Afghanistan, though his heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The auction yard manager, a thin man named Garrett with tobacco-stained teeth and suspicious eyes, kept glancing between Luke and the stallion as if expecting one of them to spontaneously combust. "You sure about this, mister?" "Jennings?" Garrett asked for the third time, his voice carrying the tone of a man who'd seen too many good intentions end in ambulance rides. "That horse has put 2 men in the hospital and destroyed more equipment than a tornado. Hell, his last owner was ready to put him down rather than deal with him anymore." Luke's pen paused over the final signature line, and he looked up to see Titan watching him through the metal bars of the holding pen. The stallion's massive head tilted slightly, as if he was listening to every word. There was something in those dark eyes that reminded Luke of his own reflection in the bathroom mirror on the worst nights, when the memories came flooding back, and sleep felt like a luxury he didn't deserve. "I'm sure," Luke said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a calling he couldn't ignore. Loading Titan into the trailer proved to be an exercise in patience that tested every nerve Luke had left. The stallion reared and struck at the metal ramp with hooves the size of dinner plates, his massive frame casting shadows that danced across the dusty ground like something out of a fever dream. 3 auction yard workers stood at a safe distance, offering unhelpful advice and increasingly creative suggestions for how to handle a horse that seemed determined to destroy anything within reach. Luke ignored them all, moving slowly and deliberately, as he'd learned to do in the field, where sudden movements could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. He spoke to Titan in the same low, steady voice he'd once used to calm his squad during mortar attacks, words that meant nothing and everything at the same time. "Easy, boy. Nobody's going to hurt you here. We're just going home." The word home seemed to catch in his throat, because Luke wasn't entirely sure he remembered what that meant anymore. But something in his tone must have reached the stallion, because Titan's ears flicked forward and his wild thrashing slowed to a nervous dance. It took 45 minutes and more patience than Luke thought he possessed, but eventually Titan stepped into the trailer with the cautious grace of a king entering exile, his hooves ringing against the metal floor like a funeral bell tolling for his old life. The drive back to Luke's property passed in a silence broken only by the occasional thud of Titan shifting his weight in the trailer behind them. Luke's hands gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford pickup, knuckles white against the cracked leather as he navigated the winding country roads that led away from town and toward the 40 acres of scrubland he'd bought with his disability settlement. The radio played old country songs about lost love and second chances, but Luke barely heard them over the sound of his own heartbeat and the rhythmic creaking of the trailer springs. Through his rear-view mirror, he could see the outline of Titan's massive form, a shadow that seemed to fill the entire space, and he wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life or taken the first step towards something he couldn't yet name. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded him of the sunsets he'd watched from guard towers half a world away, when the future had seemed as distant and impossible as the idea of finding peace. As he turned into his gravel driveway, Luke felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden, and he whispered a prayer to a God he wasn't sure was listening. "Help me not to fail him the way the world failed me." The bond between broken souls begins with a single act of faith. Subscribe to see how patience becomes the bridge between despair and redemption. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Luke made his way to the makeshift paddock he'd hastily constructed the night before, his boots crunching through the frost-covered grass that sparkled like broken glass in the early morning light. Titan stood in the far corner of the enclosure, his massive frame silhouetted against the pale sky like a monument to all the things the world had given up on. The stallion's coat was matted with sweat despite the cool air, and his dark eyes tracked Luke's every movement with the hypervigilance of a creature that had learned to expect pain from human hands. Luke carried a bucket of oats and a worn leather halter, moving with the deliberate slowness of a man who understood that trust was a currency that couldn't be rushed or forced. The distance between them felt like more than just the 30 feet of muddy ground. It was the space between two souls who had been broken by different wars but bore the same scars of abandonment. When Luke spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, the same tone he'd used to talk his way through minefields when the metal detector had failed and every step could be his last. "Morning, Titan. I brought you breakfast." The stallion's ears flicked forward at the sound of his name, and for a moment Luke thought he saw something soften in those wild eyes before the walls went back up, as impenetrable as the armor Luke wore around his own heart. For 3 hours, Luke simply sat on an overturned feed bucket 20 feet from where Titan stood, making no move to approach, asking nothing more than to share the same space under the vast Texas sky. He'd learned patience in the mountains of Afghanistan, where waiting could mean the difference between life and death, and he applied that same discipline now as he watched the stallion's gradual transformation from rigid alertness to cautious curiosity. Titan's nostrils flared as he caught the scent of the oats, his massive head turning toward the bucket Luke had placed halfway between them, like an offering on an altar. The morning air was filled with the sounds of awakening. Meadowlarks calling from the fence posts, the distant lowing of cattle from the neighboring ranch, the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees that dotted Luke's property like ancient sentinels. But beneath it all was the rhythm of Titan's breathing, deep and measured, as if the stallion was learning to trust that this moment of peace might actually last. Luke found himself matching that rhythm, his own chest rising and falling in sync with the horses, and for the first time in years, the constant tension in his shoulders began to ease. When Titan finally took a tentative step toward the bucket, Luke felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the knot that had lived there since the day he'd come home to find his wife's wedding ring on the kitchen table, and a note that said she couldn't live with his ghosts anymore. The breakthrough came on the 4th day, when Luke arrived at dawn to find Titan standing at the gate, his massive head hanging over the top rail, as if he'd been waiting for company. The stallion's eyes held a different quality now, less wild desperation and more of the quiet wariness that Luke recognized in his own reflection, the look of someone who wanted to trust but had been hurt too many times to make it easy. Luke approached slowly, his hand extended palm up in the universal gesture of peace, and when Titan's velvet muzzle brushed against his fingers, the contact sent an electric shock of connection through both of them. The stallion's breath was warm against Luke's skin, and he could feel the tremor that ran through Titan's massive frame, as if the simple act of accepting human touch was both a victory and a surrender. "That's it, boy," Luke murmured, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. You're safe now." The words were as much for himself as for the horse, a promise that felt both impossible and necessary, like all the best kinds of faith. When Titan allowed Luke to stroke his neck, the stallion's muscles gradually relaxing under the gentle pressure, Luke felt tears he didn't know he'd been holding back begin to blur his vision, and he understood that healing was something that happened between souls, not just within them. The town's reaction to Luke's purchase of Titan spread through the community like wildfire, carried on the winds of gossip that blew through Mabel's diner and the feed store with the persistence of a summer storm. Luke could feel the weight of their stares when he drove through town for supplies, the mixture of pity and amusement that followed him down Main Street like a shadow he couldn't shake. At the hardware store, old-timers gathered around the coffee pot and spoke in hushed tones about the crazy veteran who'd thrown away good money on a horse that should have been put down years ago. Sarah Martinez, who ran the local veterinary clinic, stopped by unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, her truck kicking up a cloud of dust as she pulled into Luke's driveway with the determined air of someone on a mission of mercy. "Luke, honey," she said, climbing out of her truck with a medical bag in one hand and a look of genuine concern on her weathered face. "I heard about your new acquisition. Mind if I take a look at him?" Luke appreciated her kindness, even as he bristled at the implication that he didn't know what he was doing. Sarah had been one of the few people in town who'd made an effort to check on him after he'd moved to the area, bringing casseroles and conversation in equal measure, until Luke's walls had finally convinced her that some people preferred their solitude. But as she approached Titan's paddock, Luke saw something change in her expression, a professional assessment that replaced her maternal concern with genuine surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," Sarah breathed, watching as Titan approached the fence line without the aggressive posturing she'd clearly expected. The stallion's coat had already begun to show the effects of regular feeding and gentle care, the dull patches giving way to a lustrous black that caught the afternoon light like polished stone. His ribs were still visible, but less pronounced, and there was a new alertness in his bearing that spoke of a spirit beginning to heal from the inside out. Luke stood beside her, his hand resting on the top rail of the fence, and when Titan moved to stand directly in front of them, the stallion's massive head just inches from Luke's shoulder, Sarah's eyebrows rose in amazement. "I've never seen him this calm," she admitted, her voice carrying the wonder of someone witnessing a minor miracle. "The last time I was called out to examine him, it took 3 men with ropes just to get close enough to sedate him. What are you doing differently?" Luke considered the question, watching as Titan's dark eyes studied Sarah with cautious interest rather than the wild hostility that had defined his interactions with strangers. "Nothing special," Luke said finally, though even as the words left his mouth he knew they weren't entirely true. "Just giving him time to remember that not all humans are the enemy." "I do," and the simplicity of the statement belied the complexity of the process, the daily investment of patience and presence that was slowly rebuilding both their capacities for trust. As the weeks passed, Luke found himself developing a routine that centered entirely around Titan's needs and rhythms, a structure that gave his days a purpose they'd lacked since his discharge from the army. He rose before dawn to check on the stallion, spending the first hour of each day simply being present in the paddock, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence as the world awakened around them. Titan had begun to follow him around the enclosure, his massive hooves making soft thuds in the dirt as he shadowed Luke's movements with the devotion of a creature who had finally found someone worth trusting. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. The wild thrashing had given way to curious investigation, the aggressive posturing replaced by a gentle nuzzling that sought connection rather than confrontation. Luke had started bringing a brush to their morning sessions, and the first time Titan had allowed him to groom his coat, the stallion had closed his eyes and leaned into the touch with a contentment that made Luke's throat tight with emotion. It was during one of these quiet moments, as Luke worked the brush through Titan's mane and felt the horse's breathing slow to the rhythm of deep relaxation, that he realized he was no longer just caring for a damaged animal. He was learning to care for the damaged parts of himself that he'd thought were beyond repair. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, and he had to stop brushing for a moment to steady himself against the fence post, overwhelmed by the realization that healing was something that could happen accidentally, in the spaces between intention and grace. In the quiet moments between broken souls, miracles take root. Subscribe to witness how patience transforms both the healer and the healed. The first real test of their bond came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon when the Johnson family's youngest boy, 8-year-old Tommy, squeezed through a gap in Luke's fence while chasing a wayward baseball that had sailed over from the neighboring property. Luke was in the barn, organizing feed sacks and trying to ignore the persistent ache in his left knee that always flared up before a storm, when he heard the high-pitched shriek that every parent dreads and every veteran recognizes as the sound of imminent danger. He dropped the 50-pound bag he'd been lifting and ran toward the paddock, his heart hammering against his ribs as he rounded the corner to see Tommy frozen in the center of the enclosure, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face as Titan approached with the measured gait of a predator sizing up prey. The stallion's massive frame cast a shadow over the trembling child, and Luke felt his blood turn to ice as he calculated the distance between himself and the gate, knowing with sick certainty that he would never reach Tommy in time if Titan decided to strike. The town's warnings echoed in his head like a death knell: dangerous, unpredictable, killer. And Luke found himself holding his breath as he watched the horse that had become his salvation potentially become his greatest nightmare. But instead of the violence everyone expected, Titan stopped just inches from the boy, his massive head lowering until his muzzle was level with Tommy's tear-stained face, and Luke watched in amazement as the stallion's breath ruffled the child's hair with the gentleness of a summer breeze. "Easy, boy," Luke called out, his voice steady despite the terror that clawed at his chest as he slowly opened the gate and stepped into the paddock. Titan's ears swiveled toward the sound, but the stallion didn't move away from Tommy, instead standing like a living wall between the child and the rest of the world. Luke could see the boy's small frame shaking with fear and confusion, his wide eyes darting between the massive horse and the man who was approaching with the careful deliberation of someone defusing a bomb. "Tommy, I need you to stay very still for me, okay?" Luke said, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd once used to guide his squad through hostile territory. "Titan's not going to hurt you, but I need you to let me come get you." The stallion's dark eyes tracked Luke's movement, and for a moment Luke saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Not aggression or territorial instinct, but a kind of protective awareness, as if Titan understood that this small, frightened creature needed shelter rather than intimidation. When Luke reached them, he slowly extended his hand toward Titan's neck, and the stallion leaned into the touch with the trust that had grown between them over weeks of patient cultivation. "Good boy," Luke murmured, his fingers finding the sweet spot behind Titan's ears that always made the horse's eyes drift closed in contentment. "You're such a good boy." The words were a prayer of gratitude disguised as praise, and Luke felt his knees go weak with relief as he scooped Tommy into his arms and carried him safely out of the paddock. The incident with Tommy Johnson became the talk of the town within hours, the story growing and changing with each telling, until Luke wasn't sure what had actually happened and what had been embellished by the collective imagination of a community hungry for drama. At Mabel's diner, the morning coffee crowd dissected every detail with the intensity of forensic investigators, their voices rising and falling in animated discussion as they debated whether Luke was a hero or a fool, whether Titan was a gentle giant or a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Luke tried to avoid the speculation by staying close to home, but the story followed him everywhere, to the feed store, where the clerk's eyes lingered on him with new interest, to the gas station, where other customers whispered behind their hands as he filled his truck, to the post office, where Mrs. Henderson, the postmaster, felt compelled to share her opinion that some animals just can't be trusted, no matter how much love you give them. The attention made Luke's skin crawl with the familiar discomfort of being watched and judged, the same feeling he'd experienced when he'd first come home from deployment and everyone had wanted to know if he was okay, while simultaneously treating him like he might explode at any moment. But beneath the annoyance was a deeper concern, the fear that the town's scrutiny might somehow contaminate the fragile peace he'd built with Titan, that their judgment might poison the well of trust that had taken so long to fill. Dr. Sarah Martinez returned the following week, this time accompanied by Sheriff Bob Garrett, whose presence immediately put Luke on edge, despite the man's friendly demeanor and genuine concern for community safety. They stood at the fence line, watching Titan graze in the afternoon sun, the stallion's movements fluid and relaxed, as he moved through the paddock with the confidence of an animal that had finally found his place in the world. "I have to admit, Luke," Sheriff Garrett said, his weathered hands resting on the top rail of the fence, "when I heard about what happened with the Johnson boy, I was prepared to have a very different conversation with you today. But looking at this horse now—" He trailed off, shaking his head in amazement as Titan approached the fence and allowed Luke to stroke his neck without any sign of the aggression that had defined his reputation. Dr. Martinez nodded in agreement, her professional eye taking in the stallion's improved condition and calm demeanor, with the appreciation of someone who understood how rare such transformations truly were. "I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 23 years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience, "and I've never seen a horse with Titan's history make this kind of turnaround. Whatever you're doing, Luke, it's working." The praise felt foreign to Luke's ears, unaccustomed as he was to being recognized for success rather than simply surviving. But he found himself standing a little straighter as he watched Titan's ears prick forward at the sound of his voice. The real validation came from an unexpected source, Tommy Johnson himself, who appeared at Luke's gate the following Saturday morning with his father in tow and a handful of carrots clutched in his small fist. David Johnson was a good man, a mechanic who worked honest hours and coached Little League on weekends, but Luke could see the wariness in his eyes as he approached the paddock, where Titan stood watching their arrival with alert curiosity. "Tommy's been asking about the horse every day since the incident," David explained, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a parent trying to balance his child's desires with his own protective instincts. "He wants to thank him for being gentle, and honestly, I figured it might help him get over the scare if he could see that Titan's not the monster some folks are making him out to be." Luke felt a surge of gratitude toward this man who was willing to trust his judgment despite the town's whispered warnings, and he nodded toward the gate with a smile that felt rusty from disuse. "Come on in," he said, his voice warm with invitation. Titan would probably like the company. As they entered the paddock, Luke watched Tommy's face transform from nervous anticipation to wonder as Titan approached with the gentle dignity of a king receiving subjects, his massive head lowering to accept the offered carrots with delicate precision. The sight of the enormous stallion and the small boy standing together in the golden afternoon light struck Luke as something almost biblical in its simplicity, a moment of grace that transcended the fear and judgment that had surrounded them both. When Tommy reached up to pat Titan's neck, his small hand barely spanning the width of the stallion's powerful muscles, Luke felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with his old war wounds, and everything to do with the recognition that healing was not a solitary journey. David Johnson's eyes met Luke's over his son's head, and in that shared glance was an understanding that passed between fathers, the knowledge that sometimes the greatest gift you can give a child is the chance to see that the world contains more kindness than cruelty, more hope than fear. "He's beautiful," Tommy whispered, his voice filled with the awe that only children can bring to moments of pure wonder. Titan seemed to sense the reverence in the boy's tone, standing perfectly still as small fingers explored the velvet softness of his muzzle and the coarse texture of his mane. Luke found himself thinking about the men he'd served with, the ones who hadn't made it home, and wondering if this was what they'd died for. Not the grand gestures of freedom and democracy that politicians talked about, but these small moments of connection between souls who chose trust over fear, love over judgment. As the afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, Luke realized that Titan had given him something he'd thought was lost forever. The ability to believe that broken things could still create beauty, that damaged souls could still offer sanctuary to others who had lost their way. When trust becomes a bridge between fear and wonder, miracles unfold in the smallest gestures. Subscribe to see how one gentle giant changes an entire community's heart. The drought had been building for weeks, turning the Texas landscape into a tinderbox of brittle grass and parched earth that cracked under the relentless assault of a sun that seemed determined to burn away everything green and growing. Luke had been watching the weather reports with the same intensity he'd once reserved for enemy movement patterns, noting the way the meteorologists' voices grew increasingly grave as they spoke of record-breaking temperatures and humidity levels that hovered near zero. The air itself felt combustible, charged with the kind of electric tension that made horses nervous and old wounds ache with prophetic insistence. Titan had been restless for days, pacing the paddock with an agitation that Luke couldn't quite understand until the morning he woke to the acrid smell of smoke drifting through his bedroom window and the distant wail of sirens cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like harbingers of apocalypse. He dressed quickly and stepped onto his porch to see an orange glow painting the horizon to the south, where the Hendricks Ranch bordered the state forest, and Luke felt his blood turn cold as he realized that the wildfire he'd been dreading had finally come to claim its due. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of burning cedar and the promise of destruction that would not discriminate between the guilty and the innocent, the prepared and the caught off guard. By noon, the fire had consumed 3,000 acres and was advancing toward town with the inexorable hunger of a living thing that fed on everything in its path. Luke stood in his yard, garden hose in hand, soaking down the roof and walls of his house in a futile gesture that felt more like prayer than practical preparation. The evacuation order had come over the radio an hour ago, the sheriff's department going door to door in the outlying areas, urging residents to gather their most precious possessions and head for the emergency shelter that had been set up at the high school gymnasium. Luke had loaded his truck with the essentials: important papers, a few photographs, the Purple Heart he'd never displayed but couldn't bring himself to leave behind. But when it came time to load Titan into the trailer, the stallion had balked with a stubbornness that bordered on supernatural. The horse seemed to sense something that Luke couldn't, his massive frame trembling with an energy that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with purpose. "Come on, boy," Luke pleaded, tugging gently on the lead rope as smoke began to thicken the air around them. "We need to get out of here before it's too late." But Titan planted his hooves like he was rooted to the earth itself, his dark eyes fixed on something in the distance that only he could see, and Luke felt a chill of premonition that had nothing to do with the approaching flames. The call came at 2:47 p.m., crackling through Luke's radio, with the desperate urgency of people who had run out of options and were grasping at straws. A school bus carrying 15 children from the summer day camp had broken down on Old Mill Road, the same winding country lane that Luke used to reach town, and the fire had jumped the highway to cut off their escape route. The bus driver, a 60-year-old woman named Martha Gonzalez, who had been shepherding local children for over 2 decades, was trapped with her charges in a vehicle that refused to start while walls of flame advanced from 3 directions like the closing jaws of some primordial beast. The fire department was stretched beyond capacity, fighting blazes on multiple fronts, and the nearest rescue unit was 40 minutes away, time that Martha and the children simply didn't have. Luke listened to the radio chatter with growing horror, his mind automatically calculating distances and wind patterns, and the terrible mathematics of fire behavior that he'd learned during his military training. Old Mill Road was less than 2 miles from his property, accessible through the back pasture if someone was willing to risk cutting across open ground that was already beginning to smolder with spot fires carried by the relentless wind. As he stood there weighing his options, Titan appeared at his shoulder, the stallion's massive presence somehow both comforting and commanding. And Luke found himself looking into those dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding he couldn't fathom. "You know, don't you?" Luke whispered, his hand finding the familiar comfort of Titan's neck as the reality of what needed to happen crystallized in his mind with terrifying clarity. The stallion's ears were pricked forward, his entire body oriented toward the direction of Old Mill Road, as if he could hear the children's cries across the distance and through the chaos of wind and flame. Luke had ridden horses as a boy, before the army and the war, and the long years of forgetting who he used to be, but it had been decades since he'd trusted his life to 4 legs and a heartbeat that wasn't his own. The saddle in his barn was a relic from his father's time, cracked leather that smelled of oil and memories. But when Luke carried it to the paddock, Titan stood perfectly still as he cinched the girth and adjusted the stirrups with hands that shook only slightly. The stallion's acceptance of the tack felt like a benediction, a blessing from a creature who had every reason to distrust human intentions but chose faith instead. As Luke swung himself into the saddle, feeling the familiar stretch of muscles that remembered this motion from a lifetime ago, Titan's powerful frame gathered beneath him like a coiled spring waiting for release. The radio crackled again with updates that grew increasingly desperate. The fire was moving faster than predicted, the children were running out of time, and Luke knew with the certainty of a man who had faced death before that this moment would define not just his own future, but the legacy he would leave behind. They rode out into the smoke-filled afternoon like something from an ancient legend, horse and rider moving as one across ground that sparked and smoldered beneath Titan's hooves. The stallion seemed to know the way without guidance, his powerful stride eating up the distance as he navigated around patches of burning grass and fallen trees with the sure-footedness of an animal born to this landscape. Luke could feel the heat building around them, the air growing thick and acrid as they approached the wall of flame that separated them from Old Mill Road. And for a moment his courage faltered as he contemplated the madness of what they were attempting. But Titan never hesitated, his massive frame surging forward with a determination that seemed to come from some deep well of purpose that Luke was only beginning to understand. They burst through a curtain of smoke to find the school bus sitting like a yellow island in a sea of advancing fire, its windows filled with the pale faces of children who had given up hope of rescue, until they saw the impossible sight of a man on horseback emerging from the flames like something out of a fairy tale. Martha Gonzalez stood beside the bus, her face streaked with soot and tears, and when she saw Luke approaching, her expression transformed from despair to wonder to desperate gratitude in the space of a heartbeat. "Thank God," she breathed, her voice barely audible over the roar of approaching flames. "Thank God you came." Luke dismounted and began organizing the evacuation with the same calm efficiency he'd once brought to combat situations, lifting children onto Titan's broad back 2 at a time while the stallion stood like a statue, his massive frame radiating the kind of steady strength that turned panic into hope and chaos into salvation. The journey back to safety required 3 trips through the burning landscape, Titan carrying his precious cargo with the care of a creature who understood that he held the future in his keeping. Each time they approached the wall of flame that separated the children from sanctuary, Luke felt his heart stop as he watched the stallion gather himself and leap through gaps in the fire line that seemed impossibly narrow, his powerful hindquarters propelling them through curtains of smoke and ember with the grace of a dancer and the courage of a warrior. The children clung to Luke and to each other, their small voices raised in prayers and promises and the kind of desperate hope that only the innocent can maintain in the face of overwhelming odds. By the time the last child was safely delivered to the emergency crews that had finally reached the scene, Luke's clothes were singed and his lungs burned with each breath, But Titan seemed barely winded, his dark coat gleaming with sweat and his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. As the fire trucks and ambulances surrounded them, their red and blue lights painting the smoke-filled air in patriotic colors, Luke slid from the saddle and pressed his face against Titan's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of the stallion's heartbeat, and knowing that he had just witnessed something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of courage and grace. The horse that everyone had written off as dangerous and worthless had just saved 15 lives, and in doing so had saved Luke's soul from the darkness that had threatened to consume it for far too long. When heroes emerge from the flames of judgment, legends are born. Subscribe to witness how one magnificent act transforms doubt into reverence and fear into awe. The drought had stretched across East Texas like a curse, turning the land brittle and yellow under an unforgiving sun that seemed to mock every prayer whispered skyward. Luke stood on his porch that September morning, watching the horizon shimmer with heat waves that danced like ghosts above the parched earth. The coffee in his hands had grown cold, but he barely noticed. His attention was fixed on Titan, who stood motionless in the far pasture, ears pricked forward toward something Luke couldn't yet see. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made the hair on his arms stand up, and somewhere deep in his gut, Luke felt the familiar knot of dread that had once preceded every mission briefing in Afghanistan. The wind had died completely, leaving an eerie stillness that pressed against his eardrums like the silence before an explosion. Even the cicadas had stopped their endless chorus, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Titan's massive head turned toward the western ridge, and Luke followed his gaze to see a thin column of smoke rising like a dark prayer against the pale morning sky. At first, it seemed insignificant, perhaps someone burning brush or trash, but as Luke watched, the column thickened and spread, taking on the ominous mushroom shape that every rural Texan learned to fear. The horse began to pace along the fence line, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his coat as he moved with an urgency that Luke had never seen before. There was something almost supernatural about the way Titan seemed to sense the danger, his nostrils flaring as he tested the air for scents that Luke's human senses couldn't detect. The smoke was still miles away, but already Luke could feel his chest tightening with memories of other fires, other emergencies, where he had been powerless to save the people who mattered most. His hands began to shake slightly as he set down the coffee cup, the ceramic making a sharp clink against the wooden porch rail. The first call came 20 minutes later, Sheriff Martinez's voice crackling through the old radio. Luke kept tuned to the emergency frequency. "We've got a wildfire started up near Copper Ridge," the sheriff announced, his usually calm voice edged with concern. "Wind's picking up from the west, and it's moving fast through the dry timber. All residents in sectors 7 through 12 need to be ready for possible evacuation." Luke's property sat squarely in Sector 9, and he felt his stomach drop as he realized that everything he had built here, his sanctuary, his peace, his new life with Titan, might be reduced to ash before the day was through. He thought of the neighbors who had mocked him, the people who had written him off as a broken-down veteran with more problems than sense, and wondered if they would even bother to warn him when the evacuation order came. The irony wasn't lost on him, that after surviving roadside bombs and Taliban ambushes, he might lose everything to a force of nature in the very place he had come to find safety. Titan's behavior grew more agitated as the morning wore on, the great horse circling his pasture with increasing urgency, while Luke tried to formulate some kind of plan. The veteran had learned long ago that panic was the enemy of survival, that clear thinking and decisive action were the only things that stood between life and death when chaos erupted. He began loading his truck with the few possessions that truly mattered: his father's Purple Heart, a photograph of his unit from Afghanistan, the worn Bible his mother had given him before his first deployment. But even as he went through the motions of preparation, his eyes kept returning to Titan, who had positioned himself at the gate closest to town and was pawing the ground with such force that dust clouds rose around his massive hooves. There was something in the horse's posture, something in the way he kept looking toward the distant smoke and then back at Luke, that spoke of an intelligence and purpose that transcended ordinary animal instinct. Luke had seen enough in his years of war to recognize when a situation was about to spiral beyond anyone's control. By noon, the smoke had grown into a towering wall of black and orange that stretched across the western horizon like the wrath of an angry god. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning timber and the distant sound of sirens as volunteer fire departments from 3 counties converged on the growing inferno. Luke's radio crackled constantly now with updates and evacuation orders, each transmission more urgent than the last, as the fire jumped fire breaks and consumed everything in its path with a hunger that seemed almost alive. The temperature had climbed past 90 degrees, but Luke found himself shivering as he watched Titan pace back and forth along the fence, the horse's eyes wild with an emotion that looked disturbingly like human fear. When the official evacuation order came for his sector, Luke knew he should load Titan into the trailer and head for the emergency shelter that had been set up at the high school gymnasium 20 miles to the east. But something held him back, some instinct that told him this moment was bigger than his own survival, that forces were at work here that he didn't yet understand. The sound of approaching vehicles broke through Luke's paralysis, and he looked up to see a convoy of pickup trucks racing down the dirt road toward town, their beds loaded with families and whatever possessions they had managed to grab before fleeing their homes. Mrs. Henderson from the general store was in the lead truck, her face pale with terror as she clutched a cat carrier to her chest, and behind her came the Ramirez family with their 3 young children pressed against the rear window, staring back at the wall of smoke that was consuming their world. Luke raised his hand in a wave, but none of them slowed down or acknowledged him. They were focused entirely on escape, on putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the approaching disaster. As the last truck disappeared around the bend, Luke found himself alone with Titan, and the growing certainty that something was about to happen that would change everything. Something that would test every lesson he had learned about courage and sacrifice and the bonds that connect all living things in moments of ultimate crisis. In the crucible of fire, heroes are forged and legends born. Subscribe to witness how 1 man and 1 horse will defy the flames to save a town that had forgotten how to believe in miracles. The evacuation order had been in effect for 2 hours when Luke made the decision that would haunt and define the rest of his life. Standing in his empty house, surrounded by the few belongings he had deemed worth saving, he could hear Titan's increasingly frantic calls from the pasture, deep, resonant whinnies that seemed to carry a message Luke was only beginning to understand. The fire had crested Copper Ridge and was now visible as a wall of orange flame that stretched from horizon to horizon, consuming everything in its path with the relentless hunger of a living thing. The wind had shifted again, pushing the inferno directly toward the town of Cedar Falls, where most of the residents had already fled, but where Luke knew that some of the elderly and infirm might still be trapped in their homes. His radio had gone silent, except for the occasional burst of static, and he realized with growing dread that the emergency services were being overwhelmed by the sheer scope of the disaster. In that moment of terrible clarity, Luke understood that he was facing the same choice that had defined every crucial moment of his military career. The choice between personal safety and doing what was right, regardless of the cost. Titan's calls had grown so urgent that Luke could no longer ignore them, and when he stepped onto the porch, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The massive horse was standing at the gate, his powerful body trembling with an energy that seemed barely contained, and his eyes, those deep, intelligent eyes that had seen so much pain and rejection, were fixed on the distant town with an intensity that spoke of purpose beyond anything Luke had ever witnessed in an animal. The horse's nostrils flared as he tested the wind, and Luke realized that Titan could smell something that human senses couldn't detect, the scent of fear, perhaps, or the chemical signature of people trapped and helpless in the path of the approaching flames. When their eyes met across the dusty yard, Luke felt a jolt of recognition that went deeper than words, a communication that transcended the barriers between species and spoke directly to the part of his soul that had been forged in the crucible of combat. Titan was asking for something, pleading for something, and Luke knew with absolute certainty that the horse's request had nothing to do with his own safety and everything to do with the people who had rejected them both. The decision came to Luke with the same sudden clarity that had guided him through the most dangerous moments of his military service, a crystalline understanding that cut through fear and doubt like a blade through silk. He walked to the gate with steady steps, his hands surprisingly calm, as he worked the latch that had kept Titan safely contained for the past 6 months. The horse stood perfectly still as the gate swung open, his massive frame silhouetted against the smoke-darkened sky like some mythical creature from an ancient legend. For a moment, neither man nor beast moved, and Luke felt the weight of the choice he was making, not just to release Titan, but to trust completely in something he couldn't fully understand, to place his faith in the bond they had built through months of patient care and quiet companionship. The fire was less than 5 miles away now, close enough that Luke could hear the distant roar of flames consuming timber and the occasional crack of trees exploding in the superheated air. Time was running out, and Luke knew that whatever was going to happen had to happen now, before the window of opportunity closed forever. Titan stepped through the open gate with the dignity of a king accepting his crown, his hooves making no sound on the hard-packed earth as he moved toward Luke with deliberate purpose. The horse's eyes never left Luke's face, and in their depths the veteran saw a reflection of his own determination, his own willingness to risk everything for the sake of others who couldn't save themselves. Without hesitation, Luke reached for the halter that hung on the fence post, but Titan shook his massive head and stepped away, making it clear that whatever was about to happen would happen on the horse's terms, not according to any human plan or expectation. The message was unmistakable. This was not about control or dominance, but about partnership, about two damaged souls choosing to trust each other completely in a moment when trust was the only thing that mattered. Luke felt tears sting his eyes as he understood the magnitude of what Titan was offering, the complete surrender of a creature who had been broken by human cruelty, but who was now choosing to believe in human goodness one more time. The sound of distant screaming carried on the wind, faint but unmistakable, and both Luke and Titan turned toward the town where smoke was beginning to rise from the first buildings touched by flying embers. Luke's military training kicked in automatically, his mind calculating distances and wind speeds and the probable path of the fire's advance, but all of his tactical knowledge seemed inadequate in the face of the disaster that was unfolding. The main road out of town was already cut off by flames, and the back roads would be impassable for anyone on foot or in a vehicle that couldn't handle rough terrain. But a horse could go places that no truck or ATV could reach, could move through smoke and chaos with the sure-footedness that only came from millions of years of evolution. Luke looked at Titan and saw not just an animal, but a solution, a hope, a chance to make a difference in a situation where human technology and planning had failed. The horse seemed to understand the urgency of the moment, pawing the ground with increasing impatience, as if asking why they were still standing there when people needed help. Without another moment's hesitation, Luke swung himself onto Titan's broad back, feeling the horse's powerful muscles bunch beneath him as they prepared to race toward danger instead of away from it. There was no saddle, no bridle, nothing but the trust that had been built between them through months of patient work and mutual healing, And Luke knew that this moment would either vindicate everything he had believed about redemption and second chances, or destroy them both in the flames of their own hubris. Titan's response was immediate and electric, his massive frame launching forward with a power that Luke had never experienced, carrying them both toward the smoke and fire, and screaming with the speed and purpose of a guided missile. As they thundered down the dirt road toward town, Luke felt something he hadn't experienced since his last day in Afghanistan. The absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, regardless of the consequences that might follow. When legends are born from the ashes of doubt, miracles become reality. Subscribe to witness how one horse's courage will rewrite the story of an entire town's salvation. The world had transformed into something from the Book of Revelation as Luke and Titan thundered toward Cedar Falls. The sky above them a roiling mass of orange and black that blocked out the sun and turned day into a hellish twilight. The air itself seemed to burn as they rode, thick with smoke and ash that stung Luke's eyes and made every breath a conscious effort. But Titan never faltered, his powerful legs eating up the distance with a rhythm as steady as a war drum. The heat was becoming unbearable, radiating from the approaching flames, like the breath of some ancient dragon. And Luke could feel his shirt beginning to stick to his back with sweat that had nothing to do with exertion, and everything to do with the primal fear that came from riding directly into the maw of destruction. Behind them, he could hear the roar of the fire as it consumed his property, his house, everything he had built in his attempt to find peace. But he felt no regret. Only a strange sense of liberation, as if he was finally fulfilling the purpose for which he had been spared in Afghanistan. The horse beneath him seemed to share that sense of destiny, his ears pinned forward and his breathing steady despite the hellish conditions that surrounded them. The first sign of human life came as they crested the hill overlooking Cedar Falls, and what Luke saw made his heart clench with a mixture of hope and despair. The town's main street was choked with abandoned vehicles, their owners having fled on foot when the traffic became too thick to navigate, and among the scattered cars and trucks, Luke could see figures moving, people who had been left behind in the chaos of evacuation, the elderly and disabled who couldn't move fast enough to escape the approaching inferno. Mrs. Patterson from the church was there, her walker abandoned beside her car as she struggled to help her husband, who was confined to a wheelchair and couldn't be moved without assistance. The Kowalski twins, both in their 80s and too stubborn to leave their family home until it was too late, were standing in their front yard with suitcases in their hands, staring at the wall of flame that was now less than a quarter-mile away and advancing with terrifying speed. Luke counted at least a dozen people scattered throughout the town, all of them trapped by circumstances beyond their control, all of them facing death with the quiet dignity that seemed to define the older generation of rural Texans. Titan seemed to understand the situation without any guidance from Luke, his massive head turning from side to side as he assessed the scattered groups of people and calculated the most efficient route to reach them all. The horse's intelligence in that moment was almost supernatural, his dark eyes taking in details that Luke's human mind was still processing, and when he began to move, it was with the precision of a military operation planned by a master strategist. Their first stop was Mrs. Patterson, who looked up in amazement as the giant horse materialized out of the smoke like some mythical rescue sent by divine intervention. Luke slid down from Titan's back and quickly assessed the situation. Mr. Patterson was conscious but weak, his breathing labored from the smoke, and his wheelchair was too heavy for his wife to manage alone. Without hesitation, Luke lifted the elderly man in his arms, surprised by how light he felt, how fragile, and carefully positioned him on Titan's broad back while Mrs. Patterson climbed up behind her husband to hold him steady. The horse stood perfectly still during the entire process, as if he understood that any sudden movement could be catastrophic for his elderly passengers. The journey to the emergency shelter at the edge of town took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity as Titan picked his way carefully through the smoke-filled streets, his hooves finding sure footing on pavement that was already beginning to buckle from the heat. Luke ran alongside them, one hand on Titan's neck for guidance, and the other ready to steady Mr. Patterson if the horse stumbled. But Titan's gait was as smooth as silk, despite the chaos surrounding them. When they reached the shelter, a concrete building that had been designated as a safe zone, Luke helped the elderly couple down and was amazed to see tears streaming down Mrs. Patterson's face as she looked up at the massive horse who had carried them to safety. "I never believed," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of the approaching fire. "I never believed that God would send us an angel with 4 legs and a mane. But here you are." Luke felt his own eyes burning, and not just from the smoke, as he realized that this moment was bigger than rescue, bigger than survival. It was about redemption, about second chances, about the possibility that even the most broken things could be made whole again. But there was no time for reflection, no time to savor the moment of triumph, because Luke could see that the fire had advanced even closer during their brief journey to the shelter. The Kowalski twins were still standing in their yard, now completely cut off from the main road by a wall of flame that stretched across the entire width of the street. And Luke knew that they had perhaps 5 minutes before their position became completely untenable. Titan seemed to sense the urgency as well, his powerful muscles tensing as Luke swung back onto his back, and together they plunged back into the smoke-filled maze of Cedar Falls's residential streets. The heat was becoming almost unbearable now, so intense that Luke could feel his eyebrows beginning to singe, and he wondered how much longer either of them could endure these conditions before their bodies simply gave out. But Titan showed no signs of faltering, his breathing still strong and steady, his stride still sure and powerful, as if the horse had tapped into some reserve of strength that transcended normal physical limitations. The rescue of the Kowalski twins required a different approach, as both women were mobile but too frail to ride Titan safely through the increasingly treacherous streets. Luke made the decision to lead them on foot, with Titan serving as a guide and shield against the worst of the heat and smoke, his massive body providing a buffer that allowed the elderly sisters to breathe more easily as they made their way towards safety. The journey was harrowing, with burning debris falling around them like rain, and the roar of the fire so loud that communication was almost impossible. But Titan never wavered, his presence a constant source of strength and reassurance for the terrified women who clung to Luke's arms as they stumbled through the hellscape that their town had become. When they finally reached the shelter, both sisters collapsed in exhaustion and relief, but not before each of them reached out to touch Titan's neck in a gesture of gratitude that spoke louder than any words could have. Luke realized that something fundamental had changed in that moment, that the horse who had been rejected and ridiculed was now being seen for what he truly was. Not a burden or a liability, but a hero whose courage had saved lives when human efforts had failed. In the crucible of fire, legends are forged and miracles revealed. Subscribe to witness how one final rescue will transform doubt into reverence and fear into awe. The news crews arrived before the smoke had even cleared, their cameras capturing the image that would grace front pages across Texas. A grizzled veteran on a giant horse, surrounded by the children he'd saved, their faces glowing with the kind of joy that only comes after staring death in the face and walking away. But Luke barely noticed the reporters or the crowds that gathered. He was too busy watching Titan accept the gentle touches of small hands, the horse's eyes soft with something that looked remarkably like peace. Mayor Davidson, the same man who'd questioned Luke's judgment at the auction, stood before the assembled crowd with tears streaming down his weathered face. "This town owes you a debt we can never repay," he said, his voice breaking with emotion that came from somewhere deeper than politics or pride. "You and that magnificent horse of yours have shown us what real courage looks like." The crowd erupted in applause, but Luke just nodded quietly, his hand resting on Titan's neck, feeling the steady heartbeat of the animal that had saved them all. In the weeks that followed, everything changed, not just for Luke, but for the entire community that had witnessed Grace in action. Children who'd once been afraid of the big horse now brought him apples and carrots, their laughter filling the air around Luke's property like music he'd forgotten how to hear. Sarah Martinez visited often, sometimes bringing her students to learn about the horse that had carried them to safety, and Luke found himself talking more in those afternoons than he had in years. The nightmares that had plagued him since coming home began to fade, replaced by dreams of open fields and the sound of Titan's hooves carrying him towards something that felt remarkably like hope. He'd come to Texas broken and alone, but he'd found his purpose in the most unlikely place, in the trust of a horse that everyone else had given up on, and in the moment when that trust had transformed them both into exactly what the world needed them to be.